Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history. Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I have the great pleasure of being with Eva Payne. She's assistant professor of history at the University of Mississippi. And she's the author of a book that is coming out this week, pretty soon. And you can see there the beautiful cover. It's called Empire of Purity, The History of Americans, Global War on Prostitution. It's published by Princeton University Press. And I'm very, very excited of having Eva here. How are you, Eva?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming. I really love your book. It was very, very entertaining. In addition of being super insightful, I learned a lot reading it, and I want to ask you a bunch of things about it. But before that, I would like to hear more about your career and your path. I know you did your bachelor's in the University of Wisconsin, then you did your PhD at Harvard. Now you're in Mississippi, but what's the path behind that, and how did you found interest in this very specific topic that, I mean, it's certainly part of an expanding field of cultural history, but there's not that many people doing the type of things that you do. How you got interested in this?
Um, Thank you. Yeah, so I think I became a historian because I'm nosy and kind of a gossip. I mean, I was a kid that was like climbing the apple tree near my parents in our front yard and like trying to spy on people and take notes. I've always been fascinated in what motivates people, what makes people tick. As an undergrad at Wisconsin, I majored in anthropology and religious studies because I thought that was a kind of interesting way to understand what was important to people. And then I did a PhD in American studies, actually, and I thought I was going to do more ethnographic work. I like talking to people. Actually, before grad school, I worked in a winery and very fancy restaurant, and I liked that, working at the tasting room counter, figuring out everyone's deal, pouring them wine, making them feel special, hearing their stories. But once I was in grad school, I sort of realized I could do that work as a historian. And I hadn't really thought of that before. I really thought I was going to do this kind of contemporary work. But I realized as a historian, you can be just even more of a snoop. Right? You get to really see these sort of windows into past, into people's lives. And so that really drew me to history. And in some ways, drew me to some of the characters in this project. I'm interested in what motivates them, even though I don't agree with a lot of it. And I think this project, I mean, is really one of those things where, your questions come from the present, even if your answers come from the past. And 9/11 happened my first year of college. And I was someone who was interested, a kind of budding feminist, interested in feminism, had read before about issues facing women in Afghanistan. And after 9/11, I was really shocked, concerned, confused by the rhetoric from people like Laura Bush saying, we have to go to war to protect women, right? This is a war actually about saving the women in Afghanistan. This is something that all civilization can agree upon, right? Civilization is a kind of direct quote. And we're saving women. And I was like, you're saving women by bombing them? And I was amazed with the kind of traction this rhetoric had of to save women, we bomb their houses, we totally destabilize where they live, as if that was helping. And so I think that moment for me really tuned me into how this kind of idea of protecting women, or sort of agreed upon ideas that, we have to protect women from sexual violence, from trafficking, and we have to do that by arresting them. I was really tuned into this dynamic of kind of doing violence as a form of protection, and just the way that somehow talking about women as a kind of humanitarian issue was a guise for so much more, right? For actual military and political and economic goals of the United States that had absolutely nothing to do with what made the lives of women and other vulnerable people better. And so I think some of those questions, right? How does ideas about sexuality and sexual morality get used in international politics to advance goals that have nothing to do with them?
That's fascinating, and I'm super curious about your thoughts on how your book helps us understand our world today. And I'm gonna ask you about that in a bit. But before that, I would like to get us a bit in the mindset of your book, right? And you focus on a very particular period, the second part of 19th century, early 20th century, where the US was in a very particular, let's say, stage of its international influence. So why don't you tell us a bit about that period? Give us some context for starting the conversation of what this policy towards the regulation of sexual behavior was took place, right? So build a bit the scenario of this period, please.
So the book really at its kind of broadest is about how Americans shaped international anti-trafficking and anti-prostitution policy, right, to sort of fit with domestic American policies of kind of criminalization of commercial sex and strict border control. And so it comes out, I mean, the time period I chart is also one where the US's role in the world is really changing, and these are happening alongside of each other. So a real turning point in my book is the War of 1898, when the US has to reckon with what it means to govern administrative colonies, right? Not settler colonies, of these overseas colonies. And they realize that they have to reckon with how to set up or control sex between soldiers, predominantly white American soldiers, though not entirely, but they often imagine them as white, and local women whom they consider to be not white and sort of possible vectors of disease. And so the US's sort of entry onto the world stage as a real kind of imperial power in a new way is this really important moment for sort of setting the scene for my story. And then because it also, right, it gives the government these chances to sort of experiment with policy, but it also changes the attitudes of sort of social reformers, and even expands their vision, right? Before, certainly Americans were missionaries all over the world, but it expands their vision of how they can kind of reach and civilize and shape peoples they didn't consider to be civilized in other places. And so those ideas about civilization are just crucial, right? Getting into the kind of turn of the century American ideas about civilization and race and who could be civilized, but also the dangers of being in places with uncivilized people, and particularly the sexual dangers, right? Because not only could white American men and women, right, degenerate through contracting venereal diseases, right, syphilis, gonorrhea, but there was this real understanding that they could, in some ways, right, racially degenerate, right? Their morals would be lessened, and that would actually have, because of like heredity, that would get passed down through the generations and would actually harm the American nation.
So let me ask you about a concept that you bring to put some order to what you're describing, which is you label it American sexual exceptionalism, right? Tell me about what exactly you mean by that and how it connects with the types of policy that you've described as well, this global war on prostitution, which I understand is a broader set of policies to constrain sexual behavior in general.
Yeah, so American sexual exceptionalism, that kind of term gave me the opportunity to sort of join together ideas about American exceptionalism, right? The idea that for the people in my book, sexual morality is crucial to American exceptionalism, because Americans' ability to control, supposed ability to control their sexual behavior, their sexual urges, is directly tied to their ability to rule themselves. It is a building block of democracy, sexual self-rule. And then it also ties into this idea of sex exceptionalism, the idea that sex is something outside of any other realm of life, that it's something completely different, set apart, unrelated to social and economic and political forces. And so this idea of American sexual exceptionalism allows me to think both about what Americans thought they were doing, and just important how this ideology, right, that part of how many Americans justified that the US's empire was different than what other European powers were doing was because supposedly they said the US didn't regulate prostitution. It protected women rather than sexually exploiting them, right? Unlike, the British, who had state-run brothels in India. The idea was that the US is doing something different because of this exceptional sexual morality. And yet, of course, right, they weren't exceptional at all in many ways. Everyone was concerned about sexual morality in this time period. So it wasn't, and also many other places used ideas about their own superior sexual morality to justify their own imperial aspirations and kind of projects of governance. But the US was particular in its focus on, or right, American, both state and non-state actors, in their focus on criminalization, on using prohibition, legal prohibition, as the best way to address any kind of sort of social problem, and particularly how to address sexual relationships.
Now, let me ask you to connect that because you start the book even with exploring how the origins of this sort of punitive approach is sort of connected with an anti-slavery sentiment and even an abolishing movement, I guess. What's the story there, and how do you think that these practices that you see are connected with the racial tensions that the US is sort of dealing with during this period?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the people, so the book sort of begins with this generation of activists that's coming right after the abolition of chattel slavery. So some very older folks from the anti-chattel slavery movement, abolition movement, and then some newer, younger blood that's getting in the mix. And they start out by saying, after the end of the Civil War in the United States, what's the new slavery? What is the new slavery? What's the new problem we need to solve on this, right? They had this sort of sense that the world was getting better and they could make it better. And they decided that it was state-regulated prostitution in the British Empire, which was a way of actively looking away from what was happening in the United States. And William Lloyd Garrison, right, famed abolitionist, really says this himself. It's done. We're done dealing with the slavery problem. Now we can do other things. And in fact, of course, they weren't done with that problem. After Reconstruction in the United States, there is an explosion of violence against African Americans, and particularly sexual violence. So in looking overseas, it was really a means of kind of purposefully ignoring that, as well as a kind of building on their kind of missionary ethos to help Indian women from the evils of bad British imperialism. So it was a way of sort of setting themselves apart from the British. As this, again, they might have abolished slavery later, but they were still morally superior. And then also a kind of racial triangulation happening where they sort of connected with their Indian sisters. They had a sense of a sort of shared former oppression in some ways by the British Empire, and they could save their Indian sisters from both bad Indian men and bad British administration, while they were, again, completely ignoring the violence against African American women, sexual violence against African American women in the United States.
That's so interesting, and I want us to stay for a bit in this foreign focus of your book, and I perceive in a certain way to sort of even probably implicit, but motivations for this type of policies, right? And you have anticipated that already. So one is this sort of civilizing objective, right? Very like imperial driven and very conventional in a certain way, but still deviates from, I guess, the gold standard of doing this by the British, right? But it's still pretty closely connected to everything else that comes with imperial expansion, with the deployment of the military, with war in general. So tell me more about that, and maybe it's a good opportunity to see some of the things that you described during World War One and some of the, well, even the previous Spanish American War. What's what's the story there with the army going to these places far away and this policy trying to be promoted in those places?
Mm-hmm. So what's interesting is in the War of 1898 and subsequent, right, Philippine-American War, the U.S. actually does regulate. The U.S. military and then the U.S. civil government, they regulate prostitution. They pick up the Spanish imperial method. They make a few changes to it. But they really just keep doing what all other European imperial powers are doing. However, they hide it. They hide it so that people at home can't see it. And they, again, Teddy Roosevelt makes these official pronouncements that the U.S. military cannot regulate prostitution and, would never stoop to such a level. But in reality, they're doing it. World War I is this real, actual change in policy because this group of kind of progressive era social reformers has power. They have money, lots of money from John D. Rockefeller Jr., and they have a lot of sympathetic kind of colleagues in the government, right? Some of these people are friends with Woodrow Wilson from his days at Princeton. And so they're able to say, hey, the way we've done it before, where the US military has allowed men to visit sex workers, has registered them, has inspected them to try and make sure they're not diseased, has incarcerated them if they are, and treated them forcibly. That's actually not the best way, because we have this opportunity here to do a kind of social engineering experiment like the world has never seen. And so they come up with what they term the American Plan, which is a policy that from having any sexual contact and with each other or with women or with themselves. And so, and at first they really implement this policy. This is a mainland policy. This is a policy that gets developed on the mainland, though kind of worked out a little bit during the kind of border wars with Mexico, which I can talk about later if you want. But it's a policy developed for the mainland and sort of specifically with the idea of young white men in mind, and a way of taking the sort of massive new immigrants and men of all classes who are now being, grouped together, right, through the Selective Service Act, and can be molded in all of these ways that they just couldn't be reached before. Right now, the federal government has this huge opportunity to shape a generation of men and to make them sexually moral. And so they try this out in the US, right? And they widely arrest prostitutes. Something like 30,000 women are arrested just on suspicion of being prostitutes. Something more like 60,000 is probably accurate, women arrested and incarcerated in order to sort of keep up this illusion that American men are clean and pure and morally upstanding and self-controlled. And then once they decide it's worked in the US, they take it abroad, and they do this in a few different contexts. So first, they attempt to implement it in US colonies in the Caribbean. So in Puerto Rico, for example, much like in the Philippines, the US government had been regulating prostitution, had followed kind of earlier models that were already in place, and again, had a special hospital where women who sold sex could go to be treated or to be inspected and then forcibly held and treated if they were infected. They had a register of all the women. They gave them these little tickets to show that they were, free of disease, and people, troops or anyone could have sex with them. But once the American plan, they decide it's working in the US, they say, you know what, maybe we could try it in Puerto Rico. And they actually call this the Puerto Rican experiment. So they decide to sort of test this policy in Puerto Rico because they wonder, can this amazing, particularly American civilizing policy work in this colony with these people who we don't know if it could work on. And so overnight, what has been a kind of legal, regulated form of labor, right, selling sex, becomes a crime. And because they have these registers of women who are registered as prostitutes, they can just go arrest them. And they do. They arrest over 1,000 women. And so then they decide it works in Puerto Rico and that they're going to spread it into the Dominican Republic, which is under a US military government. And then they're going to implement it in the terminal cities of the canal also. So it's a kind of interesting colonial experiment, right? We often think of the kind of colonial boomerang where colonial policy gets tested in colonies and implemented in the mainland. And this is a real kind of policy gets experimented with in the mainland, and then it gets exported or applied in colonial contexts. Well, the other way this gets tried out is in France, which is a kind of interesting case because it's not a US colony. The US doesn't have the same kind of control in France as it does in these countries in the Caribbean, right? France is a sovereign European and what they understand as white country. But they're so convinced that this kind of method of prohibiting prostitution is really the only way to keep men free of disease, but also, again, to kind of mold men into citizens fit for democracy who can win the war and civilize the world and make the world fit for democracy. First, US officials go to the French military, and the French military has brothels. Their understanding is that men need to have sex so that they can be healthy and they can fight. And the brothel is also a crucial way that the French maintain racial order. So, right, French law says you can't make laws that sort of differently apply to people by race. So, but they're still worried about Black men and white men or white women having sex. So, Black men, troops from French colonies in Asia and Africa. And so the brothel becomes really crucial because in the brothel, men of color and Black men can have sex with white women, but because it's happening in the confines of the brothel, it's okay. And it prevents, in their understanding, it happening from outside of the brothel, which would be a disaster. So, right, the brothel is crucial to French social and racial order. And then the Americans come in, and first they kind of try to do a diplomatic thing where they have these conferences with French military officials, and US military medical officials say, look, here's all this evidence. Regulation doesn't work. Regulated prostitution doesn't work. You need to prohibit it. You need to keep men away from prostitutes. Here's how well it's worked in the US. Look how low our rates of disease are. Really, we have the better way. And the French are baffled. One, the French are offended because, already, the US is coming to this war late. The US is deciding that their troops can't fight in these amalgamated units the way that other Europeans are doing, right? They're showing this sort of arrogance and this naivete that the French are like pretty annoyed by, rightfully. And then they come in and they're like, oh, also your brothels are terrible. And that is a real affront. And so, so the French are baffled. There's a great quote where they are sort of studying American policy and they say, this kind of bewildering idea that the Americans have is that they want their men to refrain from any kind of sexual activity. And the way they accomplish this is through pushing religion and violent exercise, right? They're just totally bewildered. And so these diplomatic meetings don't work. And so American military commanders just apply it. They just start to arrest and harass French women anyway, even though local officials are often saying, this is illegal. What you're doing is illegal. You cannot just arrest or harass French women. But they do it anyway. So, and they do it using kind of methods that they've developed on the mainland US. So one example in this small town of, I think it's in Blois, which is a little town in northeast France. I hope I'm getting that right. And they meet every train that comes into the city, and they follow any woman who gets off that seems suspicious to them. And if they see her talking to a man or doing something that they deem sexually suspicious, they arrest her. And then they turn her over to the French, and the French release her because she's done nothing wrong. And then Americans arrest her again, and then the French release her. And they say, sort of by this method, hundreds of women have just left the town because they've been arrested so many times. And so it really is. And they have this sort of imperialistic sense, right? That even though they're in Europe, the French, because of their, affinity for the brothel, are less civilized. They really are using this civilizational kind of ideology that's so important to how they're carrying out policy in the Caribbean. They're also using it in France to apply to white French people, but because they consider them less civilized, they also think that they need to kind of shape and mold their sexual morality as part, again, of a kind of bigger sense of transforming the world.
It's great that you explore the French case, right? Because it highlights how this is not a uniquely racial driven or imperial like motivated behavior, right? It has some deeper or at least more complex dimensions. And And I want to ask you then about what I perceive as the second sort of motivation, which is this concern about, so it's not about civilizing the other, but it's about avoiding the harms that the other could bring to our society. And you had anticipated this already, right? So this sort of concern of like moral deterioration, moral decay. What's the story there, and what are the forces pushing for that fear?
So a really important part of the story, right? If so far I've kind of focused on the uh, imperial story and the story kind of coming out of the War of 1898, there's also a real story coming out of US immigration policy. In 1875, one of the first kind of major immigration acts, right? The first federal immigration law, the Page Act, excludes Chinese people and prostitutes, right? It is specifically geared, and the understanding is also that any Chinese women would be prostitutes. So it has a kind of racial goal, but also a goal of sort of sexual purity. And immigration law it was always a major part of the story. We see ever since that law in 1875, every time a new immigration act is passed, it elaborates on the kind of categories of supposedly sexually immoral people who are inadmissible to the US or who are deportable once they arrive. And so, twinned with this fear of needing to sort of civilize people on the outside, right, is this fear that people on the outside are going to come to the US and they're going to bring their sort of sexual chaos. And that's part of the kind of flexibility of the anti-trafficking narrative that I think is so interesting. And it's really visible in this idea of white slavery that really happens in the early 20th century. Right? The sort of white slave narrative is the idea that young white girls from the countryside are being, lured or tricked or abducted by swarthy foreign men or African Americans and put into brothels in big cities. And so the solutions, right? There are two laws in 1910 passed to address this problem of white slavery. One is the Mann Act, which makes it a crime to transport a woman across state lines or national boundaries for any immoral purpose, with or without her consent. And this is really framed as a way of rescuing innocent American girls, right? It's the kind of protectionist part of the trafficking narrative or the white slavery narrative. And then the other side is also a 1910 white slave law that's an immigration act. And that act says that any immigrant woman who practices prostitution at any time after her arrival can be deported. This means if she has been in the US for 20 years and is somehow found to have ever sold sex, she is deportable. This is a huge incursion of the federal government into the kind of private sexual behavior of people, of women. And yet it's all under this guise of white slavery, of anti-trafficking. So on the one hand, you have a law that's saying, oh, we're going to protect these innocent, native-born American women. On the other side, you have a law that's saying we have to keep these like icky, sexually immoral foreigners out, but they're joined together, right, in the same sort of ideology of do we protect them? Do we punish them? Are they victims? Are they criminals? And they're often both, right? Both victims and criminals require this sort of state intervention into their lives. And so, this piece of immigration and this piece of real domestic concerns about what the sort of sexually immoral peoples all around the world, right? Especially with this idea of American sexual exceptionalism. If Americans think they have the most sort of upright sexual morality, then they're really worried that people from literally anywhere else are going to kind of bring that level down. But yeah, I think it's the twinning of the civilizing the other but protecting ourselves, protecting Native girls, but protecting ourselves from these outside sexual forces that I think gives anti-trafficking as a movement so much power.
It's fascinating how the narratives of protection often and very regularly, if anything, resemble the ones of protection, right? They seem to be hard to distinguish them, although they seem like, in principle, totally opposites, right? That's something that you elaborate very eloquently. I love that about the argument of the book. And let me ask you now something about, I guess, the micro history of the argument, and it's about the interest groups behind this policy, right? Are you do a very good job describing these partnerships between these philanthropic organizations. There's a figure of Rockefeller in particular there. But so who are the people in the US promoting for these policies to be implemented? What's the type of power that they have? What are the sort of resources that they bring into the cause? Tell me more about that, please.
Well, the story of these kind of social reformers really does track with a kind of progressive era narrative that we know, right? Kind of private voluntary reform organizations proliferate in the US in the 19th century. And in the early 20th century, they tend to, some of them, professionalize, right? So we get professions like social work as a kind of, again, more sort of credentialed way of doing what reform organizations had been doing for a long time. So in the early 20th century, so there had been kind of anti-prostitution, or more like let's rescue fallen women, unwed mothers. Those organizations had been around in the US kind of throughout the 19th century. And then in the 1870s, you see Americans join this sort of British-led movement to end state-regulated prostitution in British colonies. But again, these are voluntary organizations. And in the early 20th century, in many ways, because of this anti-white slavery movement, a lot of these kind of voluntary reformers really start to see the state and the federal government as really important allies, because they see federal laws like the Mann Act, right, the interstate prohibiting transportation across state lines of women for immoral purposes, and then also immigration law, federal immigration law, as these crucial ways to stop prostitution and the kind of idea of sex trafficking. And so they start to work in closer alliances with, local governments, state governments, and federal officials. And then they start to take jobs, right? They start to professionalize. So people get law degrees and they work, in the legal system. They become, district attorneys and state attorneys. And so they acquire power, and they also understand how to use the federal government in new ways and the state government in new ways. So they're very savvy. They understand where they should be pushing for federal laws, where they should be pushing for state laws, and they're very efficient at doing this. And so the organization that kind of emerges in the 19-teens that has the most power is the American Social Hygiene Association. And this group kind of melds together the earlier groups. So we have these people who call themselves sort of social purity reformers, people who are really interested in, ending state-regulated prostitution, kind of purifying morals. Many of them are not interested in arresting anyone. They actually don't want to arrest women at all. So they're like a little libertarian, a little anti-carceral. They're very interesting. And then we have medical doctors and people in a kind of early public health movement who are really interested in sexually transmitted infections. And they're coming to it from that perspective of concerns about the spread of disease. And then We have kind of the third group are these sort of social scientific reformers who, again, use sort of legal strategies, social scientific investigations as a way to understand these problems and promote policy. And so the American Social Hygiene Association unites these sort of diverse actors who actually they're all interested in the same issue, but they come to it for different reasons. And it unites them and kind of harnesses the moral power from the social purity reformers, the kind of scientific authority from the medical doctors, and then also the sort of, again, social scientific authority and legal authority from, again, this sort of social hygiene wing, the doctors, the lawyers, the social workers, the investigators. And the American Social Hygiene Association is funded by John D. Rockefeller Jr., so it has a really robust budget. And through it, right, because the Rockefeller organization, or Rockefeller is funding projects all over the world, so it immediately ties them into this just massive network. And so I see this organization as really the moment where the movement takes off, because this organization is really well equipped to sort of sway public opinion, to work at the legal level, and then also to work really closely with government. And in fact, during the war, people in the American Social Hygiene Association specifically joined the military so that they can implement the American plan. I mean, they say, like, this is an amazing opportunity. This horrific war is a fabulous opportunity to cooperate with the state in new ways and get our policy vision into the military, where it can shape all these young men. And then also the war is this great opportunity to spread it abroad alongside American soldiers. So they're very conscious about how these sort of state partnerships between this private organization, the American Social Hygiene Association, and the state can benefit their vision.
I would like us to finish our conversation with some discussion on the long-term consequences of these policies and how you think about the US today from the point of view of your research. Because I mean, I didn't know anything about this part of history that you explore in the book, but I like everything that you mentioned there resonated quite a lot with my experience as a foreigner in the US, right? There's something about the ethos of the country that clearly has those features that you described there as the roots. So that was at a personal level quite insightful and super interesting. So I guess I have two questions to think about this. So the first one is about your perception of the success of this policy, because, and I even thought it was a great parallel, the one that I think you aim with the title of the book, though, this global war on prostitution, as I guess compared with the war on drugs, and which has not been very successful, right? And most of the cost of this war, and I can say this comfortably because I'm Colombian, is being paid by people far away, right? And maybe that's why it's not so unpopular among the people in the US, but globally speaking, it's probably not a great idea. So, and then, however, it's been there for many decades now. So, how do you think that, what do you think were the long-term consequences of this policy? How satisfied do you think that those promoting these policies were after a few decades of the implementation of them? How do you think about the long-term impact of those policies from your perspective as a researcher, many years after the events took place?
I would say that, I mean, in some ways, they were very successful in creating this narrative where prostitution and trafficking are the same thing, where there's a strong idea that a person cannot consent to sell sex. And right, prostitution, right, the sale of sex, and many acts related to it are criminalized in the US, right? The US is a prohibitionist country except for 10 counties in Nevada, which is unusual in comparison to many other countries. And so the other kind of long-term consequence I see, or where I really see this acting in the world today, is through a range of, I guess, sort of US foreign policy. So still today, and this happens because of the 2000 Trafficking Victims Protection Act signed by George W. Bush, but any foreign organization that gets US money for work on trafficking, for work on HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, or malaria has to have an anti-prostitution pledge. So they have to say, we think prostitution is wrong and should be criminalized. Now, there's a ton of research that suggests that basically any effort, public health effort, is far stronger if it includes the people who it's targeting, right? So if you have an anti-HIV organization that specifically says, you can't work with or support sex workers, you have to denounce them, we know that doesn't work. But yet that's still in place today. So again, this sort of US obsession, I mean, it's sort of similar to, there's something similar for abortion funding as well, that there are these kind of like handcuffs on how other countries can use, NGOs and countries can use American money for really important global health efforts that affect all of us, right? Malaria affects everyone, and with global warming and climate change is going to affect more people. And yet there are these, again, really punitive restrictions attached to this money. So in that way, I see it as sort of similar to the war on drugs. It didn't work, right? This is not changing people's behavior, because in some ways it's not addressing the real problem. The real problem, as I see it, is not that people are a bunch of sex maniacs. The real problem is there's a demand for exploitable labor across sectors. And sex work is part of that. But it's not a sex problem, it's a labor problem, I think. And so similarly to the war on drugs, right? It's always going to fail because it's targeting the wrong thing. But the consequences of it are very real. They're just not visible to many Americans, right? We see, I think in the US today, we absolutely see the consequences of this vision of prostitution and trafficking and a kind of carceral approach to them. We see it in the deportation of many people who come to the US. And even as people who say, I was forcibly trafficked and forced to sell sex, they're still deported. So there's this real kind of pipeline of vulnerable migrants who sell sex and whose lives are constrained in all kinds of ways by all kinds of coercion, and they're deported by a country that claims to want to protect them. Laws that allow police to sort of arrest anyone who looks sexually suspicious, target particularly trans women of color on the streets for just being there. Because again, police discretion allows them to make up their minds about who looks like they might be trying to solicit a client. Though I should say that there are cities that are kind of trying to roll that back. There's been a successful fight against those kinds of laws. But the consequences, again, are falling hardest on migrants, poor people, people of color. But yet we still in the US have this idea I think, and I think it's really gets a lot of press and kind of right-wing circles of, the idea that you're going to take your white daughter to Six Flags and the trafficking ring is going to kidnap her. That's not real. But what is very real is the huge amount of exploited work that's happening in the United States, sexual and a whole other range of work. In terms of what my actors saw, it's a kind of interesting story. So I in some ways take this long view that what they did really does matter for today. Even if it doesn't change what people do, I think it's a really harmful framework that doesn't allow us to actually get at real problems. So after Americans sort of sneakily get these kinds of definitions of prostitution and trafficking that collapse them into a single thing and that propose criminalization and border control as the solutions, the US government kind of falls out and is like, nah, we're not that interested. After the Second World War, the US really kind of backs away from this issue until the 90s and 2000s, when a kind of coalition of evangelicals and feminists bring it back to the fore. But I argue, so even if my actors, never have the prominence again that they had during the First World War and a little bit during the Second World War, their vision is still with us. It's still in the kind of DNA of anti-trafficking policy.
And you do talk about, and I like the words you use, the DNA of this policy, which I think in a certain way it's also a bit like the soul of the American society, right? That it's there, and I think that not many people talk openly about it. So, like, you are really doing something great with this book. I'm very glad you wrote it. Thanks a lot for doing that. And thanks a lot for taking the time to chat with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate both your lovely praise, but also your really thoughtful questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged. Thank you and take care.